Did Canada and the USA ever come close to being one nation? How did Canada and the United States become separate countries? Let's find out with the help of Dan Snow's History Hit.
Why is Canada separate independence, and why is the border where it is? Various moments over the last 250 years in which the issue of Canadian annexation has been raised by American leaders, and sometimes successfully. In fact, large chunks of historic Canada are already in the USA. In roughly the first half of the 18th century, give or take, North America looked very different politically to today. Various European empires had carved out imperial possessions or colonies within North America. Those existed in competition with or alongside indigenous tribal homes, kingdoms, empires that stretched right the way across the continent. From the birth of the American Republic, there's nearly always been a lobby within the United States, which has believed in a maximalist approach to expansion. And you can see that because not only has America vastly expanded from its initial Revolutionary era borders, but there have been calls to go further in pretty much every direction. In 1847, when the US Army captured Mexico City, there was the famous All of Mexico rallying slogan, the demand that the Americans build on their success in that Mexican War by annexing the entire country. Instead, the Americans opted just to take what is now California in the American Southwest. But there was a big debate about whether or not to take the whole thing. The next big moment in the history of Canada and the US comes about a generation later. The Civil War that tore the United States apart. Well, that fueled, interestingly, another bout of gazing north. Because during the war, Britain and its North American territories had been neutral, but there was a sense in which they'd been quite friendly to the Confederacy, that the southern states, and certainly individual businesses and people, they'd traded with the Confederacy, they'd supplied the Confederacy, they'd run the blockade. The US government was pretty angry at the war's end. They said the Brits had provided assistance to the enemies of the United States. And one man was particularly furious, and that was Senator Charles Sumner, and he was important because he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he asked for reparations. He wanted Britain to pay. They could pay if they wanted $2 billion, or they could just cede the whole of Canada to the United States. And this all gets caught up with another purchase that's going on at the time. The Americans are trying to buy Alaska from Russia, and the Secretary of State, Seward, is doing the negotiating. And he really wanted Alaska because he regarded it as a first step in a comprehensive plan to gain control over the entire Pacific coast of North America. He was a firm believer in manifest destiny. He said, "Our population is destined to roll its restless waves to the icy barriers of the North." Well, that wasn't great news for Canada. And furthermore, in the great tradition of field agents providing intelligence that their superiors will like, the US consul in Victoria in British Columbia reported enthusiastically, "The people of Vancouver Island and of British Columbia are almost unanimous in their desire for annexation to the United States." And Seward actually visited Victoria, which is a city on Vancouver Island just north of that Canadian border with the US. And while he was there, he reported that British Columbians were generating petitions in favour of annexation. And in the end, it seems that there were only 2 petitions. There are 104 signatures in total. So that particular spate of enthusiasm for annexation sort of ran its course. And at the same time, the British government agreed that it would submit to international arbitration in the issue of reparations, in the issue of whether or not it had helped the Confederacy. And the British ended up making an offer of $15 million and making an apology. And the Americans in the end decided to do the easy thing, take the cash, rather than keep on pushing for massive annexations of some or all of Canada. During those tumultuous late 1860s, it's also important to state that Canada, as we understand it today, took a big step to coming into being. 1867, there was Confederation, so Canada was established as a dominion, and that was a stepping stone on a path to being effectively a fully independent country that it is today. Scoot forward now to 1911, there was a big spike of anti-Americanism in Canada, all about tariffs and their removal. Canada would be impoverished, and it could even be in that weakened state, it would be annexed by the US. In 1911, to bring that northern resource powerhouse into the American Republic, fulfilling the dream of so many American expansionists for generations. The response to this in Canada was immediate. Anti-Americanism flourished. The press went full patriot. Canadians talked about boycotting US goods, absolutely determined. It became the main issue at stake in that year's election. Obviously, friends, I'm talking about 1911, when a reduction in tariffs drove the Canadians to rally around their flag and reject what they saw was American expansionism through economic means. The Liberal government in Canada negotiated lower tariffs with the United States. It's good for trade, lower tariffs. But big business in Canada rather liked the idea of being protected against American industry. And they used their political entity, the Conservative Party, to rail against this drop in tariffs. Big Canadian businesses argued that the US would now flood the market thanks to their industrial muscle and their scale. And the election was really fought on the subject of these tariffs. And the Americans didn't help because the Speaker of the US House of Representatives was called Champ Clark. And he declared on the floor of the House, "I look forward to the time when the American flag will fly over every square foot of British North America up to the North Pole. The people of Canada are of our blood and language." Clark went on to suggest in this speech that the agreement on tariffs was actually the first step towards the end of Canada. And we hear from the congressional record that the speech was greeted with prolonged applause. So pretty mainstream. The Washington Post said in an editorial, it's clear the reason this tariff reduction is so popular is because Democratic politicians believe that it will improve the prospect of annexation. To make matters even worse, a Republican representative in the House, a member of the House Foreign Relations Committee, he introduced a resolution that asked the administration to begin talks with Britain on how the United States might best annex Canada. It didn't get many votes. In fact, it only got one vote in committee, his own vote, but the Canadians were paying attention. And the Conservatives fought that election, saying that Canada would be impoverished and it could even be in that weakened state, it would be annexed by the US. The response to this was immediate. Anti-Americanism flourished, and it was a real thing. Rudyard Kipling got involved. He wrote an appeal to Canadians. It is our own soul that Canada risks today. Once that soul is pawned for any consideration, Canada must inevitably conform to the commercial, legal, financial, social, and ethical standards which will be imposed on her by the sheer admitted weight of the United States. It was a landslide. The Conservatives were swept into office. More tariffs, please. It's odd to think about the next election, when we're going to see the Liberals trying to batter the Canadian Conservatives with those same tariffs in order to win the election. I love these bizarre twists in history. There is one more strange outburst of annexation energy, and that came after the Second World War, oddly. Newfoundland, not the whole of Canada, but Newfoundland, it was not part of Canada. It had always been a separate colony, and American money and men had poured in there during the war, and there were some in Newfoundland who felt actually their future might lie with America, not with Canada. Not a bad partner to hook up with. Canada got a little bit nervous about this after the war. It pushed for a referendum in Newfoundland on integration with Canada, and that referendum took place in 1948. Given the choice between self-government and union with Canada, the Canadian option won by 52-48, that familiar infernal split, of course. Some Americans grumbled that people had not been allowed a join the USA option on the referendum. We've forgotten our deeper history of Canada and the US. When the world was locked in the Cold War, ancient rivalries between Britain and America and Canada, for example, that were very much subsumed. They're forgotten as Western democracies circled the wagons and engaged collectively in what they saw as an existential fight for their survival. And most of us alive today, I think, are shaped by that period and the assumptions from that time, connected to a set of older, perhaps deeper strategic assumptions and priorities. Embrace of tariffs, opposition to what you would call big government, the type of government that stems from Roosevelt's revolution in American life. Distrust of the global institutions set up after the Second World War, interest in manifest destiny, in territorial expansion. In many ways, these are traditionally American values, but they're just very different traditional American values to the ones that highlighted more recently, which is being a liberal guardian of the post-World War II settlement. And we assumed that that set of values are innate, but no values are innate. Values and culture are contested. They're invented and reinvented. Our national characteristics and ambitions and strategies are not set in stone. They're not resolved sometime in the past, but we make them anew, locked in contest with our political opponents. The American values, priorities, outlining have a long historic tradition. This was the story of the United States and Canada and why they're not the same thing.
I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.